Hey everyone. So in this commentary, I wanted to discuss the dragon symbol in more depth because it is a very interesting topic, I think, that can be unpacked and described in more detail. I recently discussed this topic in my latest video uh, on the origins and history of consciousness, where I give an account of Eric Norman's description of it. But the idea of the dragon is very, as I said, psychologically potent, and it doesn't just have a singular meaning. It does have a sort of general meaning, but that can be extended into life and to a lot of different circumstances. And I also want to give some more examples as to more specifically what that symbol means, and especially the hero who fights the dragon and the sort of relationship between the hero and the dragon um, closely mirrors the situation of the psyche. Um, to start, I wanted to discuss the idea of symbols a bit more in depth. One of the things Jung talked about and saw as a problem in modern society is that we lack meaningful symbols. We are deprived of symbols that have a psychological significance. And we're more or less taught that these things are just artifacts of mythology, and we don't study the depth of these symbols as well as we could, because if we do, we start to reveal the the sort of things that humans came up with as they became more and more conscious, and by doing so, we can trace the evolution of consciousness. Um, if we closely examine the symbols that appear in mythology. And these symbols also, according to Jung, have a healing effect in that they solve many of the problems that humanity faces, many of the existential doubts and fears that emerge from civilization, from a natural being existing in rather unnatural circumstances. Many of these symbols arise as sort of solutions to the problems that arise from this situation that we find ourselves in. Just a quick example would be the Christ symbol, which is something that I plan to discuss in a lot more detail in the future. But for example, the image of Christ on the cross, the image of the Son of God dying for humanity's sins, is a very potent psychological idea, which arose right at about the point where it needed to arise. You can imagine early humans beginning to question their existence, beginning to question their purpose, and feeling quite wretched, like they had betrayed God, like they had been kicked out of the Garden of Paradise and would be never allowed back in because they were so sinful. Well, this symbol of a person basically dying for the sins of man, it sort of heals that dilemma, and that's what its function is. And it's easy for us to think that, well, of course, it doesn't actually heal anything. It's just a story. Perhaps it's interesting, but it doesn't really have any effect on me. Well, Jung would argue that, first of all, it does have an effect. And this would have been especially true for earlier humans who felt the living presence of their religion in a much deeper way than we do. Our modern secular world is very how would you say, very removed from the idea of the sacred. The idea of the sacred isn't as pervasive as it was in early cultures, who experienced the sacred very vividly. It was almost as if they were living in a sort of fantasy, whereas today we don't feel like that at all. We feel like we're living in the real world, and fantasy is just something else entirely that we shouldn't really involve ourselves in. But in any case, the symbol of the dragon and the hero who conquers the dragon and the dragon fight and the reward for the dragon fight, which is often a treasure. Sometimes a princess is guarded by the dragon who needs to be rescued, and that in and of itself is something that I should probably discuss at a later point, because that might have a very interesting psychological parallel to the situation of the psyche and the way the anima in males reveals the unconscious or acts as a door to the unconscious. But I think that's a discussion for another time, since the anima is also a very complicated phenomenon. So the dragon itself, again, early cultures would have viewed these myths in a religious light. Today, we think of mythology as just this kind of, it's a curiosity that people engaged in long ago, and, people found these myths very significant, but today we don't. It's not even just that, though. In early civilizations, these ideas were revered. They were seen as divine. They were worshipped and glorified, and there were celebrations in honor of the killing of the dragon, or in the case of the East, of the dragon itself was celebrated as a very significant symbol, which people revered because it was so relevant to their psychological situation. And the hero who overcame the dragon was seen as the model citizen, the sort of person that everybody should try to be. And so, in that sense, the word archetype here has a double meaning, where the archetype of the hero is the model of the hero, is the model of mankind in general, and is the sort of person that everybody should try to be. So let's discuss the sort of early implications of the symbol. So dragons are often or commonly these large reptilian, snake-like or lizard-like beings. The more recent dragons have wings, are able to fly, and can breathe fire. Although that idea doesn't exist everywhere. But in the very earliest depictions of dragons, and so therefore in the most sort of relevant to the unconscious mind of man, and something I can just touch on quickly is that, remember, the earlier we go back in human history, the more involuntary and less deliberate these symbols are. Mankind's consciousness has become more and more, deliberate, more and more directed as time has gone on. And so the earliest culture products of mankind can be seen as more derived from the psyche without interference from cultural values or cultural ideas, because those tend to interfere with the natural products of the human psyche, which makes sense, obviously, because, for example, our modern stories are very likely to elevate modern ideals. Modern standards of morality are likely to be the traits that the hero in our modern stories have, whereas in the past, traits that are seen as somewhat evil are sometimes the hero possesses some of these traits. For example, we probably think of humility as a moral, as a virtuous trait today, and so many heroes in our modern stories are humble. But that wasn't the case in the past. In the past, humility wasn't really a thing. There was nothing wrong with boasting about your achievements, and nothing wrong with pride, especially in early Greek and Roman cultures, which is why the hero is often this very narcissistic person, because that idea was elevated. And of course, that's just a difference of culture. That's not necessarily something to do with the psyche. But the images that arise from the psyche tend to be modified by our culture. And so the earliest cultures, you can hypothesize that they are less modified by culture and are more spontaneous products of the psyche, which can become modified later if cultural values change, which often happens, which very frequently happens. Which is why, for example, in China, the dragon is revered as a positive symbol, whereas in the West, the dragon was very commonly seen as a negative symbol. And that's, if we actually think about this closely, that's not necessarily a contradictory idea, because ultimately overcoming the dragon could mean either defeating it and getting the treasure, or befriending it and making the dragon your ally. And both ultimately mean the same thing in terms of the psyche. Okay, so I think I've rambled on long enough. Let's actually delve into what the hero and the dragon really mean. So the hero represents the ego, because again, the ego, as I've described before, is kind of a fictional premise that we associate with ourselves, and it's a very, in some sense, unusual phenomenon. Of course, we all have an ego, and so we're all familiar with our egos. But when we really delve into this idea, it becomes very bizarre, and it's very strange that a species would sort of construct this false narrative about itself. Well, not necessarily false, but it is to a certain degree fictional. But the hero, the ego, is that fictional premise, is that fictional idea of ourselves. And what does the dragon represent? Well, in terms of the psyche, so again, the dragon can be thought of in two directions. The internal dragon, excuse me, the dragon internally as it arises from the unconscious, and the dragon as an external phenomenon as it arises in nature. So let's start with the internal dragon. Fundamentally, the dragon represents the unconscious, but a specific depiction of the unconscious. It's a depiction of the unconscious as though the unconscious were something subversive, something which thwarted our will, so to speak. Now, the unconscious doesn't necessarily have to be this way, but it often is. The unconscious is often unparticipatory with our conscious ambitions, whatever those ambitions may be. I like to give a lot of modern examples because, again, a lot of this may seem sort of mystical speaking and fantastic, but I assure you that the relevance of the symbol, it applies to everybody. So it's not just something that applied to early mankind back when he was, in a relative sense, stupider than us, but it really does apply to the psychology of every single person. So for an example, we can just simply say procrastination. Now, I'd argue that procrastination and the urge to procrastinate is something which, especially if you don't want to procrastinate but just kind of do it out of habit, is something which arises from the unconscious. The unconscious, it can be characterized in a lot of ways, but one of the things that's definitely true about the unconscious is that it seeks short-term rewards. Because remember, the unconscious is almost animal-like. And if you imagine yourself being an animal, seeking short-term rewards is kind of what you do. You're constantly seeking food, you're seeking reproductive opportunities. Those are the main things you are seeking, and those are the main things that your psychology is equipped for. Not the only things, to be sure, but definitely up there in terms of your priorities. Well, that unconscious beast-like nature still exists in us today, and it's responsible for our bad habits, it's responsible for the shadow side, and if our conscious ambitions are, again, so consciousness has always been placed on this pedestal as this heavenly phenomenon. It's associated with the gods. The idea of consciousness is associated with the gods because it is so unnatural and because it's a resistance to nature. That distinction between heaven and earth is a distinction that early mythologies create to sort of capture the fact that human civilization is this resistance against nature. We can't just be our natural selves in a civilization. We need to resist that the natural psyche. And so when we go back to procrastination, that tendency arises from the unconscious, but our higher conscious ambitions are being thwarted by it. Our conscious ambitions may be, I want to do well on my upcoming exam, but my unconscious mind does not wish to participate with me and instead wants to, surf Netflix or go out and have fun when those aren't your conscious priorities. And so you have this sort of battle in the psyche. And that the dragon represents the part of the psyche which is uncooperative and is seen as a threat to our spiritual ambitions. That's where the symbol arises from. The fact that this sort of reptilian part of the human mind, the lower brain, has its own priority and doesn't necessarily care about the fact that we want to do well on our test or that we want to do better in work or whatever we want to do. Or I want to sort of generalize this because there are so many situations where consciousness, the strengthening of ego consciousness is necessary for a higher goal. For example, if you want to build a garden in your backyard, or if you want to do any project that requires a certain effort of your will. For example, me making these videos requires a certain effort of my will, since a lot of the time I'm like, I don't want to do this. But I also, at the same time, really want to do it in terms of with regards to my conscious intentions. But my unconscious mind would rather be doing something else. And so you have to resist the internal nature, the internal urge to be lazy and passive or to, a lot of things come from the unconscious, not just laziness, but sometimes aggression comes from the unconscious when you know that maybe aggression isn't the best way to deal with things. So again, your higher conscious ambitions, your ego personality, your ego self is constantly fighting with the parts of yourself that don't necessarily align with with your ambitions. And that's why the dragon is ultimately an animal. I want to discuss a bit more about this sort of idea of the reptile within. So early humans weren't, we were always looking for things in the world which felt familiar. And reptiles. I love reptiles. I've for a large part of my life I wanted to be a herpetologist, which is a person who studies reptiles. Um, but you can imagine early humans observing crocodiles or snakes and just seeing their sort of raw nature, the sort of cold, unfeeling reptilian, these reptilian entities, and they would see that as a perfect metaphor for what they experience within themselves. This kind of reptilian part of themselves that didn't really have any sort of regard for the culture products of consciousness. And that isn't even just a metaphor; it's a very real thing. Reptiles have been on planet Earth much much longer than mammals, and so and mammals evolved from reptiles, and so I've always made this argument, and people disagree with me, but it's something that I've by studying Jung and studying depth psychology, especially. Jung was very conscious of the shadow, and the shadow ultimately, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of reasons we have a shadow, but one of the reasons we have a shadow is the fact that we're so animalistic. We are these animalistic beings acting like we aren't animals. And sort of the idea of evolution, that's why the idea of evolution came as such a shock to a lot of people, because it just couldn't seem true. But the more you think about it, the more it is a sort of a serious moral problem, because fundamentally, at a fundamental level, humans are animals. We have animal-like tendencies, and the animal within man is precedent, or I guess is the animal within man evolved way before any sort of notions of humanity, of higher human morality, or of higher human conscientiousness. All of that came later, and all of that is ultimately fictional. And so you can see why consciousness has such a massive struggle fighting against the unconscious, since the unconscious is such a prevalent force in our lives, and it's been there much longer than consciousness has been there. So it's always eager to thwart us. In a lot of ways, it's really astonishing that civilization exists and that it's able to function so well. And so again, what I was saying before, I think I got off topic. Sorry if I get off topic. That happens a lot with me. But one of the things that I was discussing before is that in the earliest cultures, in the earliest mythologies, dragons are not dragons; they are snakes, and they are water snakes specifically. They're snakes that are associated with rivers. Sometimes they're associated with rain, but they're often associated with the ocean. And they're these large ocean snakes. My favorite being Jormungandr, who is the world serpent in Norse mythology. If you've played the new God of War game, he features in that, and he's one of the protagonists, actually, which is very interesting archetypally, but we'll leave the sort of archetypal discussions of modern mythology to later videos. But Jormungandr is a snake so large that he wrapped around the earth and could bite his own tail. And that immediately evokes the image of the Ouroboros. In fact, Jormungandr is an Ouroboros. He is the Ouroboric symbol. And if you recall back to one of my earlier videos, the Ouroboros is a definite symbol of the unconscious. It represents that sort of timeless space, that timeless void that humans experience the world before consciousness. Because with consciousness, we become conscious of time, and we become conscious of the passing of time. Whereas before, just the idea of time passing isn't just something that we intuitively grasp. It's something that's sort of imposed on us. We divide time into seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, seasons, years. But all of that division is just our human brain's imposition onto a physical world. We do have a sort of internal clock, and we can sort of track time, but that's relegated to the unconscious. And we don't experience the passing of time. And the Ouroboros sort of represents this timelessness, this timeless state that existed before consciousness. And so water serpents, and again, water itself is also a symbol of the unconscious because it represents sort of the unknown. You don't know what lurks beneath that water, the same way you don't necessarily know what lurks beneath your consciousness. Jung described water as the commonest symbol of the unconscious, which makes a lot of sense because, again, early humans need to find things in their environment which fit their psychological situation, or they do so naturally. The early products of culture are this sort of, the early mythological products of culture are mankind's attempts to find things in the environment which fits his psychological situation, and so feels a familiarity between what he experiences in the outer world and what he experiences in the inner world. Except before the advent of the idea of psychology, mankind has no idea that he's doing it. He just does it by habit. Humanity just does this accidentally, and it's only later, it's only today, really, in the last 100 years, that we've realized that humans have been depicting their own psychology in myths forever, for as long as there have been myths. It's just that we didn't notice that this was a psychological phenomenon until recently. Before that, we would have just chalked it up to, just making random stories. But the reason we know that these aren't just random stories is the ubiquity of the dragon symbol and the tendency for humans to idealize it. Even today, we still revere the dragon in our modern culture. And so the water snake exists everywhere. The primordial chaos serpent exists in every early culture. The Hindus, the Greeks, the Chinese, various African cultures, as well as in Mesoamerica, have this sort of water snake imagery. And it represents the deep unknown and the sort of the chaotic animal within, the reptile within, that emerges from the unconscious. And it's always defeated, or usually defeated, by some god who represents either storms, lightning, the sun, light, or some sort of other symbol of spirituality or of heavenliness, because it is that heavenly portion of ourselves which fights against this unconscious beast, which needs to subdue it in order to approach higher goals. And it's a very necessary battle, because if we sort of let this unconscious beast out into civilization may collapse. If people don't do their part, civilization may collapse. And of course, there's a lot to be said about this. Maybe civilization isn't worth preserving. That's another discussion that people can have. Another philosophical discussion. Maybe we should let the beast out. Maybe our governments don't actually serve us. But again, people can have at that in the comments if you want. I'm not going to touch it here because it's not necessarily relevant, because early cultures believed that civilization was worth preserving, or at the very least, those that emphasized the preservation of culture managed to survive, whereas those that didn't care probably, dissolved. And that's another point I want to touch on. Civilization itself is this sort of participation in a spiritual existence. We have to obey rules, we have to obey laws in order for civilization to function. But rules and laws are something which is imposed by an authority figure, aka God. In the earliest civilizations, it was literally God who came up with the laws. And this is, through the bicameral mechanism. But again, laws and morals and all of that is unnatural. There's nothing natural about morals and laws. Those are things humans invented for the purpose of keeping society structured and together and cohesive. And again, that relates to that battle between the higher spirituality and the reptilian mind. And there are a lot of with respect to civilization. Civilization itself depends upon this constant battle, because there are a lot of civilization is a very highly organized thing, a highly ordered entity. But as we know, as is clear from the universe, chaos rules. Chaos is the fundamental fact of the universe. Einstein says something along the lines of, so the law of entropy is essentially the law of chaos, that things tend to become disordered. And Einstein said more or less that if you came up with a theory that was against, or that that was against the law of entropy, you might as well just throw it in the garbage, because entropy is such a fundamental fact of existence. Disorder is such a fundamental fact of existence that it's literally built into the laws of physics. And things tend to become disorder. Things, given enough time, organized systems will tend towards disorder. And civilization is exactly the same. And I mentioned in the video that it's not just particles that do this, it's literally everything. And I stand by that because I really genuinely believe that everything tends towards chaos. And civilization tends towards chaos itself. Civilization is always at risk of breaking down. Even we could talk even about this in the modern age, this coronavirus. It's a serious threat to the structure of civilization. And if people don't do their part and don't act according to the sort of spiritual principle, they may sort of unleash the beast within, and civilization will break down. Civilization depends on everybody participating in the sort of collective imagination that which civilization represents. Okay, so another thing I should probably discuss and touch on, like I said, I could discuss this for hours. So if you're game, I really appreciate you listening. But the snake-like imagery, and again, remember, like early water snakes are the commonest symbol of the dragon, but the snake-like imagery in particular creates an aversion to the unconscious. It treats the unconscious as an enemy, as something which needs to be overcome, which ought to be overcome, and which everybody should participate in overcoming, both at the societal level and at the individual level. And this is because snakes, first of all, are reptiles, so they play into that sort of reptilian psyche symbolism. But the other very potent thing about snakes is that primates seem archetypally equipped for dealing with snakes. One theory is that our very sharp vision was an evolutionary adaptation for spotting snakes. And that's because snakes pose a serious danger to primates. As we moved into the trees, there weren't very many predators there. You know, some eagles could probably take us down, and probably leopards, and other arboreal predators. But the biggest danger, or one of the biggest dangers, was snakes. Of course, leopards and hawks are very dangerous, but we already have archetypal systems equipped to deal with them. But snakes pose a unique danger because they're very well camouflaged, and they conquered the trees long before we did. So they were already prevalent in trees. And also primates by nature are very inquisitive. So they're always sort of digging through the leaf to find insects, to find nuts, what have you. And so there's always a constant threat that they would encounter a snake and not be able to see it because snakes are very well camouflaged, or very frequently well camouflaged amongst leaf litter or amongst leaves. And so we developed a system, an archetypal system, for being able to spot snakes. So this is really weird in my opinion, and we could speculate, like, what if a different species that wasn't afraid of snakes became the dominant species on Earth? What if a species had some archetypal fear of rhinos or something? I don't know. I'm just honestly just making it up at this point. But would that species have a lot of rhinos in their mythology? That's probably a good reason why, or a fairly good hypothesis as to why snakes and dragons are so common in our mythology, because they're archetypal, because they already exist in the psyche, so they naturally come out whenever we make depictions about mythology. And this, there's a lot we could speculate about. For example, in Chinese mythology, it was believed that dragons were associated with rain and were bringers of rain. So whenever you see a rain cloud, you would probably think that there was a dragon in the rain cloud bringing the rain. Well, how much of that did they literally, was literally believed to be true? If we, based on what we know about the bicameral hypothesis, it's very possible that the archetype of the snake manifested in the idea of the dragon god, who was literally believed to be hidden in the clouds, and bringing rain, and the archetype of the snake, sort of shaped people's ideas about the weather and about floods and all that. and I could discuss that in more detail, but I think I'm going to move on to the association between the dragon and Mother Nature. So nature exists in two places. It exists in the psyche, which we just discussed, but it also exists in the outer world. And nature is also a threat to civilization. So the two main threats to civilization come from within and from without. And from without, it could be things like floods, volcanic eruptions. The Thera eruption, for example, caused serious catastrophes. It could be a drought. It could be a disease outbreak. All these things threaten society. And that's why many serpents and many dragons are associated with primordial chaos. The chaos of nature is also something that needs to be fought against actively. Humans have been obsessed with mastering nature and becoming the master of the wild, because by doing so we were able to develop new technologies and evolve much more rapidly, technologically speaking, and in terms of cultural sophistication. The mastery of nature was an idea that exists in very early civilizations and is directly related to the dragon fight, because the dragon fight is ultimately about subduing nature. And being the master of nature. And nature always poses a serious threat to humanity, because civilizations, like I said, are very highly organized and highly ordered, but that makes them very susceptible and inflexible. So it's very hard to adapt to changing circumstances when you build a civilization on certain rules and ideas, but then new circumstances force you to change those rules and to adopt new rules. Well, humans by nature are very resistant to change. We like things to stay constant. And that poses a threat to civilization, because it leads to an inability to adapt to new circumstances. And again, this is directly related to the dragon fight, because the dragon, representing this primordial nature, is constantly trying to dismantle civilization. And we need to constantly, using our consciousness, using our insight, using our wisdom, come up with new solutions for overcoming this problem. In the video I made, I used the example of Yu the Great, Yu the engineer. So Yu the Great supposedly conquered the water serpent Jianglu, the very poisonous, dangerous water serpent that appears in Chinese mythology. But in a different Chinese myth, Yu the Great, Yu the engineer, who might have been real but might not have been real, but in any case, the story still has the same psychological meaning. Yu the Great built these great flood systems, these flood control systems, because these Chinese valleys would always be struck by floods, and it would always lead to catastrophes. Well, he built this system to avoid the floods, and thereby channeling the floods, the flood waters away from the villages, and thereby saving thousands of lives. And it's exactly that myth which gives rise to the idea of Yu beating this water serpent, because this great evil which manifests in nature is being overcome by the conscious will of a man. So mankind is able to fight against nature and fight against the tyranny of Mother Nature, which is why, again, the dragon is also a symbol of the Great Mother, because Mother Nature is perceived, not necessarily is, but is perceived as this serious danger that needs to be overcome with our higher consciousness. The gods and their higher spirituality give us the tools to fight against this evil force which manifests from nature. Okay, so that kind of does give an example as to how this internal psychological metaphor applies to the external world in terms of the overcoming of nature. But it's also a very potent symbol in terms of overcoming any sort of fear, any sort of resistance. Because when you have to, again, imagine the perspective of these early human beings looking at an artist's depiction or hearing a myth about a relatively ordinary hero overcoming this massive danger. It's a very inspiring story about what humans are capable of. And if we push and we resist against fear, and if we jump into the cave of the unknown, we potentially get great rewards. It's by exploring the unknown and by taking the unknown path that human consciousness and human knowledge and human innovation are able to evolve and expand. If we don't take the leap into the unknown, we'll never learn anything new, and therefore be relatively sterile. That's what human beings are in a lot of ways. We do resist change, and we do resist taking the leap into the unknown. The unknown is scary. It represents chaos. We naturally resist chaos, and we naturally resist the unknown because we have a natural tendency to fear it. But what the dragon myth symbolizes is that leap into the unknown, is that fighting against resistance, is that facing is a representation of the hero facing something which is inherently terrifying. Because if we don't face our fears, there's no chance of us being able to grow. Either you grow in psychological terms. And yeah, so you can see why this symbol was so elevated, because it speaks to the psyche, and it speaks to the situation of the psyche, but it also lends us the healing factor, the healing significance of representing what we ought to be doing, how we ought to conduct ourselves in the world. And the answer to how we ought to conduct ourselves is that we should not be afraid to face the unknown. We should have courage. And courage is a very difficult thing. People naturally aren't very courageous. Courage is a very rare thing, in fact. But if you are able to summon courage, it will reap great rewards. And if you're able to overcome things which are inherently difficult to overcome, it will reap great rewards. For example, let's just do an example. Getting to the moon, back during the space race. That's a very difficult challenge. There's a million things that could go wrong. And yet, how could humans ever, get anywhere beyond this planet unless we challenge ourselves to that very difficult goal? It's much easier to just sit back and let our species decay. But eventually, we're going to have to leave this planet. And the challenge of leaving this planet is something that is immensely difficult. But the symbol of the dragon is specifically that symbol of taking the risk and doing something difficult, doing something which our instincts are reverse to doing, going out and again, I emphasize the fact that it's a sort of resistance that we're coming up against, and that resistance can manifest either in the world itself or within. I'd say usually it resides within, because if you overcome your fears, it's ultimately a psychological battle. If you face something that's difficult to face, it's an external battle in the real world, but it's also a psychological battle to master your own psyche. So far, I've hoped that I've conveyed the significance of the dragon symbol, what it means, why it was so elevated, why it was worshipped, essentially, why the hero was worshipped as this sort of, because again, the ego often feels like it's small, and it feels like it's up against this large, overwhelming force. And there's nothing more satisfying than the story of the small hero who's an ordinary guy overcoming this giant, terrifying force. It feels so triumphant. And I guess that's sort of the very simple way of explaining it, that people just like to see stories of little guys overcoming big dangers. But what I'd like to emphasize, and what I've been trying to emphasize, is the psychological dimension attached to that. That this is not just, this isn't just a story. It's a symbol which is relevant to everybody. So I hope I've conveyed that adequately. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was, if I could just recall what it was the treasure. The treasure that the hero gets as his reward for defeating the dragon. So remember, the dragon is a very general symbol of the unconscious, but it's specifically a symbol of the unconscious part of ourselves, which is uncooperative, and therefore in opposition, and therefore doing battle with the ego. But of course, there are various depictions of the unconscious that don't depict the unconscious in this manner. A very common, one symbol is water, which is just a general symbol of the unconscious. Water is relatively neutral. It's not good or evil. It just is. Excuse me. Water simply is. It's not like this great evil that you need to overcome. But another symbol of the unconscious is the horse. The horses appear very commonly in people's dreams. That's something that Jung noted. So they could be archetypal, but what I think is more likely is the fact that they are something in the environment which speaks to the psyche at a certain level. And horses are our best friends. They help us a lot. But mankind was able to recognize the fact that horses relative to them, man, are relatively unconscious. And they are a good symbol for the cooperative unconscious. So again, the unconscious could be something that thwarts our will, but it could also be something which helps our will, which if we learn how to channel properly, is actually something which is very helpful for us. And this is something that I've argued with respect to Chinese dragons, since a lot of Chinese dragons are depicted as symbols of power, but aren't necessarily evil. I'd say that that Chinese culture has turned the symbol of the dragon into a positive symbol of the unconscious. That something which is definitely powerful, but can be useful if you channel it properly. And this is what the defeating of the dragon means. It means you've overcome the unconscious, and now in some respect it is your friend, and it's able to help you. In Western cultures, this is often depicted as gold, as the princess, as the reward for killing the dragon. And the reward is, again, like I said, a better relationship to the unconscious. If you, the ego, battle against the unconscious and successfully subdue it, it can become your ally. And the example I want to give of this, again, there's a lot of circumstances in which this is true, but the example that I want to give is of learning an instrument. So whenever you're learning an instrument, this applies to learning anything really. Learning how to play a sport better, learning how to swim, learning anything. But when you're learning an instrument, you have to deliberately practice, which means you need to take your conscious ego and deliberately force yourself to play the instrument and to practice. Otherwise, you're never going to get better. This is what psychologists call deliberate practice. And it's deliberate practice which contributes greatly to the development of any skill. If you don't deliberately practice, you can expect that skill, if you've acquired it, to go away. You need to keep practicing in order to maintain that skill. So you need to use your ego consciousness to force yourself to do something which you naturally encounter resistance to doing. The resistance will probably come in the form of laziness, of feeling like you have something better to do or putting it off, in order to gain short-term rewards. But if you deliberately practice the instrument and you overcome the unconscious urge to not practice, what you gain is the fact that this skill becomes relegated to the unconscious. Your unconscious is now your friend. You don't need to, when you become very skilled in an instrument, you don't need your conscious will in order to play it skillfully. That becomes relegated to muscle memory and therefore the unconscious. And so if you successfully subdue the unconscious will serve you. And this occurs in a lot of different circumstances, not just playing an instrument, but any sort of deliberate practice of any skill. You can turn any sort of skill into an unconscious function if you first use consciousness to practice it. So again, one of the things I want to emphasize is the fact that consciousness is actually relatively weak. I emphasize having a strong ego as is definitely a good thing, but just because you have a strong ego doesn't mean your ego can do everything, and eventually there will be a weakness of consciousness. And so it's very stressful to use your conscious will all the time whenever you do things, which is why you need to use your consciousness in order to build the skills so that you no longer need your consciousness to do those skills, that they become sort of second nature. Interesting phrasing, actually, second nature. Very relevant to what we're discussing. So anyways, I hope that sort of conveys what I mean by the dragon symbol. The dragon symbol represents the internal unconscious, which is opposed to our conscious will, and that idea can be projected outside into the environment in various relevant situations, whether it's the collapse of civilization or whether it's practicing an instrument. And defeating the dragon, or taming the dragon, which I prefer to think of it as taming the dragon, the symbol of Marduk, taming the dragon Mashushu, is very potent for me, is a very good metaphor for the unconscious. And I hope that this idea becomes more widespread, that you should tame the inner dragon. And I hope that in a lot of ways, because I do see a lot of problems with today's society in terms of our psychological health, and I do hope that symbols make a comeback and that we can see the relevance of symbols. That's kind of what one of the goals of my channel is, to show that the fantasy products of mankind aren't just for fun. They have a real psychological meaning and a real relevance to daily life. And I'm hoping that the idea of the dragon, of overcoming the dragon, resonates with a lot of people, and that they can use this idea as a metaphor for their own lives in order to overcome whatever unconscious difficulties are thwarting their wills. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. If you stayed long enough to listen to this point, congratulations. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Take care.